All right, in section one, we're going to look at a little bit of introductory material about what statistics is, some basic concepts of it, and then we're going to talk about, in section one, some different kind of variables and how a categorical variable works and what we can use it for. So first of all, what is statistics? What are we getting into? Well, statistics by definition is the science of data. So we go and we collect data and we try to say something interesting about it. So we can collect it, we can organize it, we can analyze it, but we're trying to take this data and we're trying to say something useful about it. We typically do this through the process of what's called data analysis. So in data analysis, this is going to be the process of organizing, displaying, summarizing, and asking questions about the data. So if we are doing some kind of data set, let's say we're collecting data about everyone's favorite color. Then when we take all this data that we get from everyone's favorite color, we can group how many people like which color. Maybe the majority of people like red or green or blue or whatever it may be. Then we can display those results in some kind of graphical summary. We can summarize the data, maybe numerically somehow, and then we can ask questions about the data. Maybe our sample shows that the majority of people in a class like the color red. Does that mean everyone in the country likes the color red? Maybe, maybe not. So that's kind of the idea of data analysis, is kind of the driving force behind statistics. So some other important terms that you'll hear about a lot in the course. We talk about individuals a lot. So an individual is just going to be an object that is described by a set of data. So if my data is the favorite color, then my individuals would be the people who like that color. And then we have variable. Variable is going to be the characteristic of the individual. So the individuals are the people. They could also be things. They don't necessarily have to be people. And then the variable is something that's describing that individual. So if I have people in the class as my individuals, and their favorite color could be the variable I'm interested in, because that is some kind of information about that group. So when we talk about these variables, there's going to be two types of variables we're going to look at in this course. We're going to definitely look at the second one more than the first one. But those two are categorical and quantitative. Sometimes you also heard of categorical referred to as qualitative. So if you've heard that in a previous coursework or somewhere, that's basically the same thing. But for us, a categorical variable, we're going to place individuals into one of several groups. So if those groups are favorite color, then everyone will go into one of those groups. I'm going to go into the group where red is my favorite color, or green, or blue, or whatever that may be. That's a categorical variable. So the opposite of categorical is going to be our quantitative. And for a quantitative variable, it's going to take a numerical value for which it makes sense to take an average. So if I say number of miles driven to school, then that would be a quantitative variable, because I could obviously find the average number of miles driven to school for a group of individuals. But other things that are numbers, maybe not so much. If I say that student A is number 1 in the class and student B is number 2 in the class, well, if I take an average of those, that doesn't mean that the students are 1.5 as an average ranking. It kind of doesn't make sense to take an average of things that like rankings. So that would probably be more of a categorical thing. So another big thing that we'll talk about a lot is the concept of a distribution. And we'll look at an example of that here in a second. So a distribution is going to tell what values a variable can take and how often it takes it. So some variables have lots and lots of values, some have less. Because if I think about it, if I take about colors, there's only so many colors I can list. But if I say something like weight of an animal or weight of something, there are infinitely many things I can do for that quantitative variable because you can have decimal weights and all these kind of things. So there's really infinitely number of values in that distribution. So some distributions are what we call discrete because they only have a certain number of values they can take on. And others are called continuous because there are lots and lots and lots of infinitely many values it can take on. So let's look at an example here. Here you see a bunch of different animals we have, and then I have the corresponding weight of each of these animals. So if you can see here, we have the weight for the fox is 20 pounds, and so on and so forth. So what is the variable we're trying to measure here? Well, the variable we're trying to do is going to be this weight. So the weight of the animals is going to be our variable. And that is, of course, going to be a quantitative variable because I can take average weight and things like that without any problem. Now the individuals are going to be the animals under study. So in this case, all those different animals, the fox, the Arctic fox, the river otter, the toddler, the goose, all these different kind of animals are going to be our individuals. And for them, we're collecting information about them with these variable of weight of these animals. All right, so now we kind of know a little bit about data, about what the individuals and variables are. So we're going to talk about a really, really simple way to organize and display your data, and that's with a dot plot. Now, a dot plot is simply a graph where you're going to have each dot represent one individual. So in this case, we have each of these dots for the weights of the animals. So we have this dot here, which would be at 25, in between 24 and 25. So if I go above, I can look at what animal weighed 25 pounds. That would be the beaver. So this beaver is represented by this dot. And then just each dot represents a value going up. This is not the greatest way to display data, but a dot plot is very fast, very efficient, very easy to make. It kind of gives me an idea of what the distribution looks like. I can see my lowest value is 14, my biggest is 25. I can see that they're kind of roughly distributed equally amongst the middle, but you can kind of see a little bit from the dot plot. Sometimes you can see if one is much, much larger or much, much smaller than the rest of the group. This would be a really, really easy way to see how that works. Okay, one of the other things we're going to do is we're going to look how can we explore this data. So once we collect all this data, numeric, quantitative, categorical, how do we explore it? What do we do with it? So there's a couple different branches of statistics we're going to talk about, and they all really have to do with the population and the sample. So a population, kind of like you've thought of, it's going to be an entire group under study. So it could be a group of people, it could be all American citizens, that would be a population. It could be just a single classroom. A whole classroom of 25 students could be my population. It just depends. So from that, what we're going to do is we are going to take samples. It is very difficult to sometimes get data from an entire population. So what we do is we will get data from a sample. So sample is going to be part of the population. And there are lots of different samples in a population. If I kind of think about my population as this kind of shape here, then I could have a sample could just be like a small part of that. A different sample could be like this part. Maybe they share a little bit. They don't have to share a little bit. I could also have one down here. So there are lots of different samples in a population. Most population, the best thing you can have for a population, for a sample, is it's representative. A sample that actually looks very similar to what the population does. As we'll see in the course, that is very difficult to do, and we are always striving for that, but it is kind of difficult. So that kind of brings us to our two branches of statistics we are going to talk about, and that is descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. So descriptive statistics are things you've probably done before. They are just going to describe a sample set of data. So if I have three numbers, if I have 3, 4, and 5 as three pieces of data, I can find their mean. Their mean is going to be 4. Add them up, divide by 3. There's no real doubt about this. This is basically 100% true. It's just describing the set of data. The average, the mean of these three numbers is 4. That varies a lot with inferential statistics, which is not always so straightforward. Inferential statistics, what we're going to do is we're going to use information from the sample to make conclusions about the population. So this, you can probably imagine, has a lot more variance in it because there are lots and lots and lots of different samples. And if you don't get a representative sample and you say something about your population based on that sample, it might not be accurate. So we try to get a sample that's representative so these decisions, these conclusions we make about the population are as accurate as possible. And this will be a whole branch of statistics that we'll go down and look at in the future, but something to keep in mind. All right, so now we're kind of moving to section 1.1. So this first section, we're going to talk about categorical variables and kind of how we display those. And in section 2, we'll talk about quantitative. And then section 3, we're going to talk about some basic descriptive statistics that we can do on some data sets. So categorical variables, remember, these are variables that can be put into categories, not the numerical data that can be averaged and things like that. So colors or feelings or hair color or anything like that could be a categorical variable. Quite honestly, we don't use categorical variables as much. Most of the stuff we'll do is quantitative, but a little information about it is always good. So here is a distribution of a categorical variable. It is the feelings, political feelings of people that are 21 or older. So I have this displayed two different ways. So these are my different feelings. This is the variable I'm asking these people. And here is the raw number of the people that felt that way. So there were 2,012 people who felt very undecided about politics. And there were a total of 38,381 in the sample. So of course I can also do those as a percent. So here in this column, you can see I've done those as a percentage. Generally, categorical variables can be done as a raw count, like how many in each category, or as a percentage. So if we look at this, if we ask what is the variable under study, well, the variable that's under study, it's not really any of these feelings, it's actually the political feelings of those 21 or older. So that's why this little title is very important, because if I just said feelings, we really wouldn't know what these feelings are about. So our big goal in this section is to figure out some graphs that'll look good for these categorical variables. And there are mainly two kind of graphs that we use for categorical variables. So for categorical variables, we'll generally use a bar, graph, or a pie chart. And in a separate thing, we will go through how to make these on sheets, how to make nice bar and pie charts. But for now, just know those are the two. Now, most people have seen a bar and a pie chart, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. But here is a bar and a pie chart that I made on Google Sheets that represents this distribution. So this is the political feelings pie chart, and you can see that each pie chart represents a proportional amount of the percentages of each category on its pie. So this pie slice here, this red slice, is leaning somewhat. That represents 20% of the data collected, so it represents 20% of the area of this circle. So if you had 50%, it'd be half the circle, 25 is a quarter of the circle, etc., etc. And you can see I have a nice title, I have a key, so those are always good things to have on your graph. Secondly, here you see that I have a bar graph of the same thing. And this one I did as a raw count, but I certainly could have done the percentages. I decided to do raw count, but you certainly could have used the percentages. So again, you have your title, your key over here, and then each one just kind of goes in order. Doesn't really matter what order, because it's your categories. One category isn't necessarily better than the other. So you can just kind of see I just went from left to right on how it was. There is a different type of bar graph called a Pareto chart, where you always put the biggest bar first and you always go to the smallest bar. Kind of a similar thing, just depends how you want to make your graph look. So a couple things in both these graphs I think that we can agree that are good. It's got a good title. We like to label the axes and things like that. And I didn't really label it here. I could label it as frequency or something like that, but that's always a good. You want to label each category, that's always good. So we want to do this because there are obviously, I'm sure everyone's seen lots of bad graphs. I could make a bad pie chart. I could do something like this and say this is 20% and this is 80%. That's obviously very bad. I could just have a pie or a bar chart, and this is a terrible thing too, where you get the bars not only smaller, but they get skinnier, so your eye plays tricks on you, and it looks like they are much smaller than they actually are. So try to keep all the bars the same width as you do your bar chart. So that's all for the introduction in section 1. Please let me know if you have any questions as you're going through this.